The sun was brutal that afternoon, beating down on the pavement like a hammer. The heat was thick, suffocating, but inside a locked police car it was even worse. A scorching metal box with no escape. Sweat poured down his face, his breathing grew heavier, and his head started spinning. He banged on the window, but the two officers outside just laughed. To them, this was a joke. A little fun at his expense. They had no idea who he was, just another black man they decided to mess with. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was something else. Either way, they weren't in a hurry to let him out. But what they didn't know was that they had made a terrible mistake. The man trapped inside that sweltering car wasn't just anyone. He was the mayor's brother. And the moment they realized it, everything changed. Their grins faded, panic set in. The heat that had been burning his skin was now creeping up their necks. Because now it wasn't just a game. Now they had to face the consequences. But was it too late? Would an apology be enough? Or had they just put their entire careers, and maybe even more, on the line for a cruel joke gone too far? The officers, unaware of the man's true identity, had followed him down a quiet street, their patrol car's sirens cutting through the calm afternoon air. When they pulled him over, it was for something trivial, something that wouldn't have even made the local news. But the power dynamics at play were anything but trivial. One officer, the younger of the two, was quick to escalate the situation. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore, it had become a chance to assert authority. He'd yanked open the door and ordered the man out of his car, his voice sharp and commanding. The man, confused but compliant, stepped out. That's when it started. They threw him in the back of the patrol car, locking the doors. The sun blazed overhead, and the heat inside the car was unbearable. He pleaded, banging on the windows, his breath getting ragged, but the officers only looked on, laughing at the spectacle. They made cruel jokes, tossing words back and forth like they were playing some kind of twisted game. Neither of them had any reason to think this would be anything more than a harmless prank. But all that changed when one of the officers caught sight of a familiar face across the street, a neighbor who worked at City Hall. A look of shock crossed the officer's face as he recognized who the man inside the car was. And suddenly, that harmless joke was something much darker. The younger officer's hands began to tremble as he stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the neighbor across the street. The older officer, oblivious to what was happening, chuckled at some joke he had made and leaned against the squad car. But the younger officer couldn't shake the feeling that something had just gone horribly wrong. He could feel the tension building in the air, thick as smoke, but he wasn't sure what to do. Should he say something? Should he just get in the car and drive away? But it was too late for that now. The neighbor, who worked in City Hall and whose own family had a long-standing relationship with the mayor, had seen the scene unfolding. The recognition was immediate. His expression shifted from casual indifference to utter disbelief. He stepped closer, his face tense with confusion, trying to make sense of what was going on. "Is everything all right here?" he called out, his voice steady but filled with unease. The younger officer opened his mouth, but found no words. The air grew even heavier, and panic seeped into his thoughts. What if this got back to the mayor? The consequences of his actions, the consequences of the joke, could be far more than just a reprimand. He'd heard the rumors. This wasn't just any politician. The mayor had a reputation for handling things harshly when his family was threatened, even indirectly. Inside the patrol car, the man was now gasping for breath, his face a grim shade of red. His hands were pressed against the glass, desperately trying to signal, but the officers were still in the dark. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea how far this could spiral. And the neighbor. He wasn't sure if it was better to speak up or walk away, but either way, he knew things were about to change for everyone involved. The younger officer's stomach twisted as the neighbor's eyes flicked from him to the man locked in the car. A cold sweat dripped down his back, his mind racing. He knew what could happen if the mayor found out about this. It wasn't just the humiliation of being caught in a lie. It was everything that could come after it. The mayor's brother was someone people respected, someone whose name carried weight. And now the younger officer had just trapped him in a squad car under the hot sun like some kind of criminal. He glanced over at his partner, who still stood with his arms crossed, laughing like nothing was wrong. The older officer hadn't yet noticed the shift in the atmosphere, hadn't seen the neighbor's troubled face, or heard the sudden change in the air. But the younger officer felt it. Something was unraveling. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, that instinct that told him this wasn't going to be a simple screw-up. The man inside the car slammed his fist against the window again, his breath shallow and erratic. Sweat soaked through his clothes, and he was no longer just pleading. He was banging with a sense of urgency. His face was contorted with a mix of pain and frustration, but the officers still didn't move. They were too caught up in their own arrogance, too drunk on the power of the uniform to realize what was happening. But then the mayor's brother locked eyes with the neighbor, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared recognition, an understanding that this was no longer just a bad joke. The neighbor stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You need to let him out. Now." The older officer turned to look at the neighbor, his face scrunching in confusion, but the younger officer's heart began to race faster. He knew there was no going back now. Whatever happened next, it was too big to just disappear. The question was, would they have enough time to fix it before it all came crashing down on them? The younger officer felt his pulse quicken, his instincts screaming at him that things were spiraling out of control. Just as he took a step toward the neighbor, ready to apologize, hoping he could still make it right, a second patrol car pulled up. He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The new officers stepping out were unfamiliar, their eyes scanning the scene with curiosity. One of them, a tall officer with a sharp jawline, noticed the tension immediately. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone colder than the others had been. The neighbor didn't flinch, but his eyes darted back to the locked car. He knew he had to act fast. The more people showed up, the harder it would be to cover up what had happened. Before anyone could respond, a voice rang out across the street, one that carried authority and fear. "What the hell is going on here?" It was the mayor, storming down the sidewalk with his usual confidence, his face already contorted in disbelief as he took in the scene. His eyes locked on the patrol car, and for a moment, everything froze. The younger officer felt a lump form in his throat. This was it. The mayor's presence alone changed everything. This wasn't just about a prank anymore. It was about power, consequences, and the kind of trouble that couldn't be smoothed over with a simple apology. But there was more. As the mayor approached, he stopped suddenly, his eyes widening. Behind him, someone had appeared, a woman clutching her purse tightly. The younger officer squinted, recognizing her immediately. It was his ex-wife. A chill ran through him as he realized what this could mean. His ex-wife was close to the mayor's family. She had connections, and it wasn't just her presence here that was alarming. It was the look of suspicion in her eyes as she glanced from him to the locked car. He knew then that the situation had grown even more complicated. What had started as a careless joke was now entangled in a web of politics, family secrets, and relationships that none of them were ready to face. The mayor's voice cracked through the tension like thunder, commanding attention from everyone standing in the street. "Open the down car," he ordered, his words sharp, cold with fury. The younger officer scrambled to comply, his hands fumbling as he rushed to unlock the door. His heart pounded in his chest, and as the door finally clicked open, the man inside stumbled out, gasping for air, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The mayor rushed to his brother's side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. There was no hiding the anger in his eyes now, no pretending this was a misunderstanding. The officers stood there, frozen, realizing just how badly they'd messed up. The older officer, still caught in disbelief, couldn't even muster a defense. The younger officer, guilt-ridden and shaking, met the mayor's eyes. He knew this was it, the moment where everything came crashing down. But just as things seemed to reach their breaking point, another voice cut through the air. The woman standing behind the mayor, his ex-wife, stepped forward. "You're not going to get away with this," she said, her tone steady, but laced with something darker. The officers looked at her, confused. The mayor, however, seemed to know exactly what she meant. He turned to her, his brow furrowing, but before he could speak, she revealed the truth in a single sentence. "I know what you've been doing. You think this was just a joke, but it was never about that, was it?" Everyone stood in stunned silence as the woman pulled out a file from her purse. The officer's eyes widened as she opened it, revealing photographs of the younger officer meeting with a rival politician. His secret dealings, his attempts to sabotage the mayor's family from within, all laid bare in that moment. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. What had started as an abuse of power, a cruel prank gone wrong, had morphed into a web of betrayal and deception, far more complicated than anyone had expected. The younger officer's face drained of color as he realized that his mistake was only the tip of the iceberg. With a final bitter glance at the officers, the mayor turned to his brother, pulling him away from the scene. The woman, having revealed the truth, locked eyes with the younger officer one last time, her expression unreadable. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. In the end, it wasn't just about what happened to the man locked in the car. It was about what was buried beneath the surface all along, a conflict that no one saw coming. As the mayor led his brother away from the scene, the younger officer stood motionless, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had thought a prank, a little power play, would go unnoticed. Now, everything was unraveling in front of him, and the consequences were far beyond what he'd ever imagined. The woman, the mayor's ex-wife, watched silently, her eyes cold and calculating as she tucked the file back into her purse. There was no satisfaction in her gaze, just a quiet sense of resolve. She had exposed the corruption that ran deeper than anyone had realized. The officers were left in the street, standing together, but their bond was shattered. The younger officer couldn't even look at his partner. He knew his career was over, that his life would never be the same. The mayor had power, and it was clear that the game was now in his hands. As the crowd dispersed, whispers filled the air. The story would spread quickly, the scandal, the abuse of power, the betrayal. The questions lingered. How many more secrets were hidden in the dark corners of politics? How far would the mayor go to protect his family? The younger officer would never know, but one thing was clear. Sometimes, a small decision could change everything. And for him, there was no turning back now.